cruel billionaire, confronted by a fearless single mother, and fell in love without knowing it. Picture a towering Manhattan skyscraper where power and luxury collide under shimmering city lights. At the very top reigns an untouchable billionaire, Alexander Harrington, the man people both fear and admire. Down on the streets below, Elizabeth Parker, a fierce single mother, battles adversity with unwavering courage and a heart full of hope for her young son. By fate's twisted design, their paths collide in a tumultuous confrontation that changes both their lives forever. In a storm of secrets, betrayals, and unforeseen alliances, witness how a single mother's fearless spirit breaks down the steely walls of a ruthless billionaire and ignites a love neither expected. Alexander Harrington was no stranger to adoration or disdain. He had in many ways inherited New York City's largest financial empire from his late father, Marcus Harrington, whose aggressive business strategies were legendary even on Wall Street. Despite the city's tabloids often painting Alexander as a polished gentleman, a philanthropist who occasionally donated millions to high-profile causes, those who knew him privately understood his frosty, often cruel demeanor. Still in his 30s, Alexander was tall, handsome, and impeccably dressed. He boasted a regal presence that demanded attention the moment he entered any room. Just ask Lucia, his dedicated personal assistant, who had been at his side for years. Even she, loyal as she was, found it challenging to gauge his moods. One moment he would be nodding curtly with an air of icy politeness. The next he'd be hurling swift, biting remarks that stung even the most seasoned of business executives. To most, Alexander's world was every bit the dream, a never-ending reel of lavish parties, exclusive galas, private jets, and quiet whispers in corridors of power. CEOs from around the globe courted his favor. Billionaires like Elon Musk and Bill Gates sometimes joined him for private functions, and foreign dignitaries sent him personal invitations to speak at their conferences. His influence reached industries spanning technology, real estate, and even film. New York's elite lived in quiet fear of Alexander's capacity to make or break fortunes with a subtle flick of his pen. But behind the scenes, Alexander Harrington carried a deeper wound, seldom revealed to anyone. His father's relentless expectation of perfection had molded him into a man who believed vulnerability was the surest path to pain. From the tender age of 6, Alexander had been shipped away to the best boarding schools, taught that emotion was weakness, and hammered into shape by a father who valued results above all else. Achievements became Alexander's only measure of self-worth, and the pursuit of profit ruled his life. As a result, empathy wasn't in his repertoire. Compassion lay buried beneath decades of ambition and fear. There was something else that gnawed at him, a fear that if he ever let anyone close, he would relive the heartbreak he endured as a boy craving his father's approval. So he wore his cruelty like a shield. That shield had kept him safe from heartbreak thus far. To outsiders, he was cold, calculating, and ruthless. He was the man who had seized smaller companies without remorse, who had shuttered entire factories because a spreadsheet told him it was financially sound, and who rarely, if ever, apologized when stepping on others to get ahead. And yet a single, ordinary woman would soon flip his world upside down. One chance encounter born out of confrontation would show Alexander Harrington that even the mightiest walls can crumble when faced with the unyielding strength of a fearless mother protecting her child. The stage was set for a collision of two vastly different lives, two worlds that seemed unable to coexist. And in that collision, neither would remain the same. Down where the skyscraper's tinted glass filtered out the hustle of the city streets, Elizabeth Parker lived a life that was in every conceivable way worlds apart from Alexander Harrington's. Elizabeth was 28, with gentle brown eyes and a steadfast determination etched into every line of her face. She worked 2 jobs, one as a secretary at a small law firm, another as a waitress at a late-night diner, and every single day she rushed through traffic, chased the city's subways, and endured the endless demands of a hectic routine, all in pursuit of a single unwavering goal: to provide for her son Michael. Michael was only 6, but possessed a heart far larger than his tiny frame would suggest. His curiosity was insatiable, and Elizabeth often smiled wearily as she answered his 10,000 questions before bedtime. Despite the heavy load of responsibilities she carried, her love for him was inexhaustible. In her eyes, Michael deserved the world, or at least a fraction of the opportunities that wealthy children like Alexander Harrington's acquaintances took for granted. Michael's father, Jonathan, had abandoned them 2 years after Michael's birth. At first, he had seemed a promising partner, enthusiastic, supportive, and loving. But the weight of fatherhood proved too great. Eventually, he vanished, with nothing but a scribbled note. There was no apology, no closure. Left behind, Elizabeth had no choice but to navigate the city's tough waters alone. She embraced her role as a single mother wholeheartedly, yet she faced constant struggles. Bills piled up incessantly. The rent on her modest 1-bedroom apartment in Queens was overdue. Her meager salary barely stretched far enough to cover groceries, let alone unexpected medical expenses or the occasional treat for her son. Often she settled her own meals as a second thought, a $1 slice of pizza or leftover bread from the diner, just to ensure Michael had a proper dinner. Still, if there was one thing Elizabeth possessed in abundance, it was resilience. No matter how loud the city's sirens or how heavy the burdens she shouldered, she rose each morning with renewed hope. Each day was a fresh chance to earn a little more, do a little more, and push Michael closer to a better future. In her quiet hours at the law firm, while the attorneys rushed to negotiate deals and plan lawsuits, Elizabeth often allowed herself a single precious fantasy. She imagined building a secure life for her son, perhaps a safer neighborhood with a small backyard where Michael could play a decent school, where he could learn freely, and maybe, just maybe, a sliver of financial stability that would let her rest easy. Little did Elizabeth know that a twist of fate would place her directly in the path of the man who best embodied the financial power she lacked. Soon, the unstoppable force of her maternal love would collide with the immovable object of Alexander Harrington's pride and cruelty. Their lives were about to intertwine in unexpected and explosive ways, and neither had the faintest clue that their worlds were on the verge of shattering. It started like any other Thursday for Elizabeth. She woke at 5:30 a.m., hurriedly prepared breakfast for Michael, and left him in the care of Mrs. O'Leary, a kindly retired teacher who watched him when Elizabeth's early shifts called. The day felt ordinary enough. She hopped onto the 7 train from Queens, jostled in the daily commute among a sea of tired faces and coffee cups, and raced into the law firm's lobby, just in time to avoid being late. But that day held the seeds of a tremendous change. Word spread around the office that Alexander Harrington, the powerful billionaire whose name made even the senior partners fidget, was scheduled for a meeting. The hush that fell over the corridors was palpable. Everyone scrambled to prepare, ensuring the conference room sparkled. The coffee was perfectly brewed, and the ambiance exuded professionalism. Elizabeth had heard about Alexander Harrington, of course, though she'd never met him. The man was rumored to have the cunning of a panther and the heart of a glacier. The attorneys, especially the junior partners, seemed more rattled than usual. The law firm had been trying to secure Harrington as a client for months, an achievement that promised high-profile cases and lucrative deals. If Alexander Harrington decided to do business with them, it could boost the firm's reputation significantly. Her first glimpse of Alexander in person proved the rumors about his imposing presence to be true. He swept through the lobby with 2 bodyguards in tow, and Lucia, his personal assistant, carrying a sleek briefcase behind him. His tailored suit fit like a second skin, and he wore a classic watch that likely cost more than Elizabeth's annual salary. His eyes were alert, scanning the environment with cool detachment. When their gazes briefly locked, Elizabeth felt an unsettling chill surge down her spine. She tried to focus on her tasks, greeting them politely, directing the party to the conference room, offering coffee and refreshments. But beneath it all, she sensed a powerful current of tension. As she set his cappuccino before him, Alexander barely grunted in acknowledgement. He didn't see her. Not truly. She was just an interchangeable face in a sea of staff he encountered daily. Soon enough, she retreated to her desk outside the meeting room. Papers rustled, voices rose and fell. Occasionally, snippets of conversation filtered through the door. She heard talk of a real estate venture, some grand redevelopment plan, in her own neighborhood in Queens, ironically enough. Elizabeth frowned. She recalled receiving a letter about possible eviction if the building was sold or redeveloped. Could Harrington's empire be behind that letter? The thought unsettled her, but she had no proof. When the door burst open unexpectedly, Alexander emerged with a face etched in ice. It seemed the negotiations hadn't gone smoothly. As the attorneys scrambled behind him, Alexander's typically measured voice boomed. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here for solutions." The harshness of his tone shot straight to Elizabeth's heart. The attorneys, flustered and perspiring, promised to revise their proposals immediately. Then in the swirl of tension, Alexander brushed past Elizabeth, inadvertently knocking a stack of papers from her desk. Her immediate instinct was to apologize, an ingrained habit. But something in her snapped. This man with his billions, his arrogance, and his oblivion to the struggles of ordinary people had the nerve to push her aside like she was invisible. She squared her shoulders, bent down to pick up the scattered papers, and in a moment that marked the beginning of her rebellion, she found herself glaring at Alexander Harrington's retreating back. He didn't even glance her way. And in that second, Elizabeth Parker felt the smallest spark of defiance. A spark that soon enough would blaze into a confrontation neither of them could ignore. That fateful meeting planted a seed of curiosity in Elizabeth's mind. She couldn't shake the coincidence of the rumored redevelopment of her neighborhood. The law firm was deeply entwined with Harrington's dealings. Maybe they were working on some grand plan that would forcibly displace residents like herself. The next few days brought her confirmation. She overheard a conversation between the senior partner, Mr. Coleman, and his associates. They were finalizing the paperwork for a massive construction project in Queens. Terms like eviction, rezoning, and profit margins floated in the air. Everything pointed to Alexander Harrington being the puppet master behind this looming threat. Fear and anger warred within Elizabeth. Her humble apartment in Queens might be run down and cramped, but it was still her only sanctuary, the only roof she could afford for Michael. If Harrington's plans went through unchecked, she and many other families would be out on the streets in months, forced to find new housing in an unforgiving market. Although it felt like standing up to a dragon with a wooden sword, Elizabeth couldn't remain silent. She kept remembering how Harrington had brushed past her, how his indifference stung more sharply than any intentional insult. So one afternoon, when the law firm was once again brimming with Harrington's presence, another round of negotiations. No doubt, Elizabeth made a bold decision. She waited outside the conference room. Anxiety tightened her chest, and 1,000 cautionary voices told her she was risking her job by confronting the firm's most important potential client. But she thought of Michael, of how he'd just started first grade in a decent local school, how he was making new friends and feeling safe, how he had found a small community that accepted him. None of that could be torn away, because a billionaire wanted a new set of luxury condos. When Harrington stepped out, his expression as stoic as ever, Elizabeth cleared her throat, standing in his path. It was a daring move. She had never done anything so foolhardy in her life. Yet there she was, meeting his cold stare with surprising calm. Alexander narrowed his eyes, not used to being blocked by a stranger, especially an employee of the firm trying to gain his business. "Yes?" he asked brusquely, his patience evidently running thin. Elizabeth inhaled. "I'd like to speak with you about your Queen's redevelopment plans, Mr. Harrington." He tilted his head, perhaps slightly intrigued, or maybe irritated by this direct approach. "I'm in a hurry," he said curtly. "I'm not sure you're in any position to question my business dealings." But Elizabeth wasn't deterred. "I live in one of the buildings that might be demolished. I have a young son, and that apartment is all I can afford right now. I just want to ask if there's any arrangement or extension you could offer families like ours." The hallway grew tense. Associates and staff members gaped, uncertain whether to intervene. Harrington's face hardened. In a voice laced with cold steel, he replied, "That's not how business works. Miss Parker," she supplied, her voice clipped. "Elizabeth Parker." His gaze flicked to her name badge, then to her eyes. "I do what's best for my company. My responsibilities are to the shareholders and the growth of my investments. I am not a charity organization." Elizabeth's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay composed. "With all due respect, Mr. Harrington, there are people, families counting on you to show some humanity." A fleeting flicker of something that might have been conflict flashed in Alexander's eyes, but it vanished as swiftly as it had appeared. "I admire your audacity," he said quietly, "but spare me your moral crusade. Business is business." He turned on his heel to leave, but Elizabeth wasn't finished. "It doesn't have to be that way. You have the power to change things to make a profit without destroying lives." Her words hung in the air, echoing in the hush of the corridor. For a moment, Alexander paused mid-stride. He turned slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he strode off, bodyguards and assistants trailing behind. Elizabeth realized her entire body was shaking. She had done it. She had confronted Alexander Harrington. Had she changed his mind? Likely not. But maybe, just maybe, she'd planted a seed. The aftermath of Elizabeth's bold confrontation reverberated through the law firm like a shockwave. Mr. Coleman, sensing the tension, summoned her to his office soon after. Inside, the atmosphere was stifling. The blinds were half-drawn, casting slats of light across the mahogany desk, and the room smelled faintly of expensive leather Elizabeth missed her. Coleman began pressing his fingertips together in a steeple. "You do understand how precarious that situation was, don't you?" She swallowed, nodding, but refusing to let regret overshadow her conviction. "I do. But with all due respect, Mr. Coleman, I had to stand up for my home and my son." He exhaled slowly. "I understand your predicament. However, I must caution you to tread carefully. Alexander Harrington is a potential key client of this firm. If he feels in any way harassed or disrespected, our entire relationship is jeopardized. And that's not good for anyone here, including you." Elizabeth's posture remained firm. She refused to back down from the moral high ground she'd staked. "I never intended disrespect, sir. But I can't pretend that what he's doing doesn't have real consequences for families like mine. I only asked him to consider the human cost." A heavy silence filled the room. Mr. Coleman scrutinized her as though weighing the situation. In the end, he simply nodded, though the tension in his clenched jaw was unmistakable. "I'll let this pass, Elizabeth. But consider this your first and only warning. If you have questions or concerns, bring them to HR. Don't ever confront a client or potential client directly." "Understood." "Understood," Elizabeth said, a knot of fear and determination twisting in her stomach. Outside the office, whispers circulated among her co-workers. Some expressed cautious admiration for her courage. Others predicted that she would be fired for challenging a billionaire. But Elizabeth, though anxious, felt strangely empowered. She had stood up for herself and the families in her neighborhood. That alone gave her a sense of dignity the city often tried to strip away. Days slipped into a tense routine. Harrington's deal with the law firm advanced swiftly, with meetings doubling in frequency. Documents were revised, clauses inserted and removed, all to ensure the developer's plan could proceed without legal hurdles. During this period, Elizabeth found it harder to sleep at night. She wondered if an eviction notice might land on her doorstep sooner rather than later. One evening, as she clocked out of the law firm, her phone buzzed with a text from her building manager. It stated that all tenants had 90 days to vacate. Elizabeth stared at the message in dismay. It was happening. Her heart pounded as she thought of Michael, of the bedtime stories she read to him in their cramped living room of the corner where he displayed his drawings. All of it would be uprooted because a powerful man wanted to reshape the skyline once again. But Elizabeth wasn't the type to go down without a fight. She joined community meetings, spoke to neighbors, and even caught the attention of local journalists. Her story and that of her neighbors started to ripple out into the city. Headlines began to appear in smaller publications. Queens residents fight to stay in their homes. In a surprising twist, Elizabeth found an unexpected ally. Lucia Alexander Harrington's assistant reached out to her discreetly after learning about her plight. Lucia didn't explicitly state her motives, but Elizabeth sensed she had grown tired of witnessing the fallout of Alexander's relentless deals. Through hushed phone calls and after-hours meetings, Lucia slipped Elizabeth tidbits of information, corporate memos, timelines for the planned demolition. Armed with those insights, Elizabeth and her neighbors built a modest legal strategy to stall the project. But the path ahead was daunting. The more she resisted, the higher the stakes became. She received veiled threats from anonymous callers, possibly from Harrington's corporate allies. Friends warned her that crossing Alexander Harrington had dire consequences. He was known to ruin people. She had to be careful. Still, none of these threats quelled the fierce determination burning inside Elizabeth. She had faced worse trials in her life: abandonment, financial struggles, single motherhood. This was just one more battle, and if she had to stare down Alexander Harrington himself to keep her son safe and give him a decent future, she would do it 1,000 times over. While the adults sparred in legal documents and behind closed doors, Michael sensed the tension swirling around his mother. He noticed the worry lines that had deepened on her face, the hurried phone calls she made late at night, and the anxious glances she exchanged with neighbors when they crossed paths in the worn hallway of their apartment building. As a 6-year-old, Michael didn't grasp the complexities of housing laws or multi-million-dollar developments. But he did understand one thing: something was threatening his home. He overheard snippets of conversation about moving about, losing the only place he'd ever known, about searching for a new school. The mere thought of it made his stomach twist. Elizabeth tried to shelter him from the worst of it. But in a city as crowded and hectic as New York, secrets don't stay hidden for long. On one particularly tough evening, Michael found his mother quietly crying at the kitchen table, head bowed over an eviction notice. It broke him to see her tears. Carefully, he approached small arms wrapping around her waist in a hug. "Mum," he said softly, "why are you sad?" Elizabeth dried her eyes, looking into her son's curious gaze. For a moment she hesitated, uncertain how best to explain the precariousness of their situation. Then she took a shaky breath and forced a smile. "Just grown-up problems, sweetheart. We might have to find a new place to live soon, but everything will be okay." Michael stared at the notice and recognized a few words. Eviction. He couldn't pronounce it perfectly, but Elizabeth heard the attempt, and her heart squeezed painfully. She knelt down, pressing her forehead against his. "I promise, no matter what happens, I'll take care of you." Michael nodded solemnly. "I know, Mom." Despite her vow, Elizabeth still felt the weight of uncertainty. The next day, she took him to a small playground near their apartment. As he scampered around the worn jungle gym, chasing after new friends, she felt an immense ache in her chest. This place held so many memories. Michael had taken his first wobbly steps here, had proudly shown her how he conquered the slides. The prospect of leaving it all behind loomed larger by the day. That night, as they returned to their apartment, Michael spotted flyers taped on doors and lampposts. They depicted a bleak picture of the upcoming demolition. He tugged on her sleeve. "Mum, is that the building?" Elizabeth knelt beside him. "Yes, honey. They're planning to tear it down." For a moment, Michael was silent. Then he looked at the flyer again. In his youthful imagination, the building wore a sad face. "I don't want them to break our home. Can we fix it?" Elizabeth wrapped him in a hug. "I'm trying, Michael. I'm trying so hard." The heart of a child is pure and honest, and Michael's unwavering faith in his mother moved her in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She realized that her fight wasn't just about a building or paying rent. It was about preserving the place where her son had begun to form his earliest, happiest memories. And so, buoyed by her child's innocence and trust, Elizabeth gathered the shards of her courage. She forged ahead with her search for a solution, seeking any help she could find. In the face of Alexander Harrington's seemingly omnipotent power, all she possessed was her determination, her maternal love, and a budding network of supporters. Little did she know that soon fate would once again thrust her into Harrington's path, this time in a manner that would bring both of their guarded hearts to a slow, unintended thaw. Unbeknownst to Elizabeth, Alexander Harrington was battling his own inner turmoil. Despite his unyielding facade, her heartfelt plea had unsettled something deep within him. For the first time in years, he found himself haunted at night by memories he had sought to bury long ago, memories of a small boy who once longed for his father's attention and a sense of belonging. High above the city's lights, perched in his penthouse suite, Alexander gazed at the sprawling skyline. His mind drifted to a day long past when at age 10 he'd tried to persuade his father to fund a local arts program at his boarding school. He'd been so excited to share his dream of painting a mural with classmates from less privileged backgrounds. But Marcus Harrington had dismissed him with a scoff, instructing Alexander that money is not for pity, it's for power. That night, Alexander recalled he cried himself to sleep, in the cold dormitory bed. Over time, every expression of empathy Alexander attempted was rebuffed by his father, hammered into the hardened steel of business logic. Feelings and philanthropy were weaknesses that risked giving people an advantage over you, Marcus would say. It was a lesson Alexander absorbed all too well. Now hearing Elizabeth Parker's voice echo in his thoughts, begging for consideration, he couldn't help but recall his younger self. But habits died hard. The voice of his late father still insisted that empathy was a liability. Between meetings, Alexander's personal assistant Lucia observed subtle changes in her boss. He was more withdrawn, more prone to silent stares through the window. His retorts, once snappy and precise, grew more clipped, as if his mind drifted elsewhere. After a particularly intense board meeting, Lucia lingered behind to finalize the minutes. Alexander stared at the conference table. Finally, he looked up. "Lucia," he said in a low voice. "This Queen's redevelopment, is it justifiable?" Surprised by the question, Lucia hesitated. "In purely financial terms, yes, it is. The profit margins are significant, and the firm's projections show I'm not talking about the profit margins." Alexander rubbed his temples, almost as if weary. "What I mean is, are we doing too much damage by tearing these buildings down? Are we forcing too many people out?" A flicker of compassion crossed Lucia's face. "You've always made your decisions based on what's best for the company." "Alexander," she replied carefully, "I can't speak for everyone else, but it would displace hundreds of families, yes?" His features hardened in an instant, as though catching himself veering off the script he'd followed his entire life. "Yes, well, business is business," he muttered, echoing the old refrain. Lucia nodded, but inside her heart clenched. She had never seen him so uncertain. She was torn between loyalty to her employer, the brilliant yet often cold man she'd followed for years, and her own growing sympathy for people like Elizabeth. Alexander sank back into his chair, resisting every gentle tug of conscience. He couldn't afford softness. Not now. Not ever. Each time he remembered Elizabeth's eyes, wide, determined, defiant, an unwanted pang of guilt rippled through him. She was a reminder of something he had locked away, the possibility that power could come with responsibility. That compassion wasn't always a weakness. But old scars, especially those inflicted by fathers, run deep. So Alexander Harrington clung to the life lessons he'd learned at his father's knee. Compassion had no place in his carefully orchestrated empire. If the cost of expansion was homes, families, and neighborhoods, so be it. He'd chalk it up to necessary collateral in the relentless pursuit of success. Little did he know fate was already weaving another thread, pulling him and Elizabeth closer. Their next encounter would not only shake his convictions, but also cast him in the unexpected role of a protector. And for a man who believed empathy was a liability, he was about to discover just how powerful and liberating true compassion could be. The tide began to turn one evening, when Elizabeth rushed home from her second job at the diner, an anxious knot forming in her stomach. She had stayed late. Her boss pleaded for an extra pair of hands due to a staff shortage, and now she worried about Michael. Mrs. O'Leary was reliable, but Elizabeth despised leaving him in someone else's care for too long. As she approached her apartment building, she sensed commotion. Red and blue lights flashed across the street, and a small crowd had gathered. Heart pounding, Elizabeth pushed her way forward. Near the entrance, a policeman was speaking in a low tone, while paramedics tended to someone sitting on the curb, a child. Her knees nearly buckled when she recognized Michael's jacket. She sprinted, fear gripping her chest, ignoring the policeman who tried to hold her back. "That's my son!" she shouted. Michael. Michael looked dazed, a bruise forming on his forehead. Tears threatened Elizabeth's eyes as she knelt beside him, cradling his small face. "What happened, baby?" His voice trembled. Some guys started yelling in the hallway. "Mom." They were telling Mrs. O'Leary to mind her business, that this building wasn't worth fighting for. One of them pushed me when I tried to run to our apartment. Elizabeth seethed. She glanced at Mrs. O'Leary, who was shaking visibly, giving her statement to the police. It seemed that a pair of intimidating men had come by, presumably on behalf of the developer or some unscrupulous ally. They'd posted final notices on every door, threatened to throw belongings onto the street, and hurled insults at anyone who resisted. The paramedics assured Elizabeth that Michael would be fine, just a minor bump, though they suggested checking in with a doctor if he displayed any troubling symptoms. Holding him tightly, Elizabeth felt a torrent of anger and helplessness. Fear scratched at the edges of her mind. If this was the extent to which Harrington's associates would go, how much more danger lay ahead. But fear for her son quickly ignited into rage. She recognized this tactic as a form of harassment designed to scare people into leaving before the official eviction. While she had no direct evidence linking the men to Alexander Harrington himself, it was clear they acted under the developer's umbrella. This was the monstrous side of corporate expansion, the foot soldiers who bullied the vulnerable into compliance. The next morning, Elizabeth made a decision. She would speak to a local news station that had covered neighborhood displacement stories before. She had tried to reason privately, but that had gone nowhere. Now she would go public. Footage of Michael's bruised forehead, testimonies from neighbors, and the brazen intimidation tactics could create enough negative press to slow the project at least temporarily. Sure enough, the news crew arrived the following day, cameras rolling as they interviewed tearful residents. Elizabeth's voice trembled slightly under the spotlight, but she spoke with conviction about how their building faced not just demolition, but violent threats. A small crowd cheered her on, neighbors rallying behind her bravery. Her story spread faster than she expected. Within days, the video clip went viral on social media. Comments poured in from supportive strangers, demanding justice to cynics who believed gentrification was inevitable. City council members began receiving calls, and activists started to form small protests around the site. Alexander Harrington, of course, caught wind of the uproar. He watched the footage on a large TV in his office, face taut. Seeing Elizabeth on the screen stirred conflicting emotions. She was so visibly shaken, but also fiercely determined. And there was Michael, his innocent face marred by that bruise. Alexander felt something unravel in his chest. He instructed Lucia to get him more details. If his project was being compromised by thuggish contractors or unscrupulous allies, he wanted control of the situation back. After all, losing public favor could affect his bottom line, tarnish his carefully curated philanthropic image, and hamper future deals. Yet beneath that business-driven motivation lay something more personal. The image of a child's tears, the echo of Elizabeth's pleas, both stirred old memories and new uncertainties. Was this the price of success? Could he justify such intimidation in the name of a bigger paycheck? Before he could fully process these questions, Alexander realized Elizabeth Parker was about to become more than just a face in a crowd. Circumstances would soon force him to stand directly between her and danger. And in that collision, he would discover that the lines he'd drawn between profit and compassion weren't nearly as rigid as he believed. Alexander Harrington's decision to intervene came rather unexpectedly, at least to those who thought they knew him. He had reigned over countless developments in multiple cities, always delegating dirty work to trusted underlings. But this time, the public outcry was louder. The mayor's office received numerous complaints. Local television stations kept looping Elizabeth's tearful account of the assault on her son, and even social media platforms buzzed with trending hashtags criticizing Harrington's project. As the negative PR escalated, Alexander decided enough was enough. He contacted the head contractor, a man named Bruno Morales, known for his ruthless methods. In a terse phone call, Alexander demanded that any intimidation tactics cease immediately. Bruno, caught off guard by Harrington's direct order, muttered something about getting results and moving people out faster. But Alexander cut him off. He didn't care how Bruno interpreted the job. There would be no more violence, no more terrorizing tenants. Shortly after, Alexander headed downtown for a scheduled business luncheon. Fate, however, had other plans. As he stepped out of his limousine onto the busy street, he spotted a cluster of reporters across from a small protest near City Hall. Signs read, "Save our homes and stop Harrington's bulldozers." His jaw tightened. The last thing he needed was to be ambushed by the press. He almost told his driver to keep going, but something made him linger. Among the protesters, he saw Elizabeth Parker. She was wearing a simple coat, holding Michael's hand. The boy clutched a sign, scribbled in crayon, "Don't destroy my home." A pang of discomfort shot through Alexander's chest. And then chaos erupted. A group of counter-protesters, likely people supportive of the development, or simply hired agitators, appeared and started to shout insults. One launched a plastic bottle that nearly hit Michael. Reflexively, Alexander moved. He strode across the street, ignoring Lucia's protests. Reporters recognized him instantly, cameras whirring and flashing. Suddenly, Michael stumbled in the jostling crowd, and Elizabeth lunged to catch him. But there was a surge of bodies, and she lost her balance. Before she could hit the pavement, a strong arm caught her. Startled, Elizabeth looked up, and her eyes met Alexander's. It was surreal. The powerful billionaire, the very man she'd been fighting, was holding her up so she wouldn't fall. A hush fell over the crowd. Cameras focused on the two of them, both breathing heavily in the confusion. Michael stared, uncertain whether to be scared or relieved. Elizabeth, regaining her composure, braced herself for Alexander to lash out. But he surprised everyone by turning to the rowdy group and barking, "Stop this immediately." Some recognized him, some didn't. But the sheer authority in his voice made them pause. The moment hung in the air, reporters itching for a sensational angle, protesters glaring at Harrington, Elizabeth and Michael caught in the middle. Alexander steadied Elizabeth. "Are you all right?" he asked in a low voice. She blinked, heart hammering. She never expected genuine concern from him. "Yes," she managed, pulling Michael closer. Sensing the tension, the police on site intervened, dispersing the agitators. In the aftermath, Elizabeth found herself standing face to face with the man she had considered her enemy. Her cheeks flamed confusion, swirling with resentment, and an odd flicker of gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured, though her tone was guarded. Alexander nodded, his expression solemn. "Take your son and go home," he said tersely, but his voice lacked its usual edge. "This place isn't safe for him." Elizabeth didn't have time to process what had just happened. Holding Michael's hand tightly, she left the scene, the media frenzy swirling around them. The moment, however, remained lodged in her mind, Alexander's arm around her waist, his eyes searching hers for signs of injury. For his part, Alexander was left standing on the sidewalk, cameras capturing his every move. Journalists shouted questions. "Mr. Harrington, Does this mean you're giving up the development? Are you siding with the protesters now? Why did you help that woman? He ignored them all, slipping back into his limousine. Thoughts whirling. Why did he intervene? Was it purely for damage control, or was there something else? A flicker of concern he couldn't quell. That night, instead of reviewing profit statements or acquisitions, Alexander found himself replaying that moment, Elizabeth's fearful eyes and Michael's shaky stance. Something shifted in him, a sensation he couldn't quite name, both unsettling and strangely exhilarating. And so two paths that once clashed in opposition now began to converge, though neither Alexander nor Elizabeth fully grasped the magnitude of what was unfolding. Inadvertently, Alexander had protected Elizabeth, and in doing so, chipped away a small fragment of his own emotional armor. Over the ensuing weeks, the public dispute over the Queen's development simmered and occasionally flared. The confrontation at City Hall had caught so much media attention that local politicians started pressuring Harrington to re-evaluate the displacement plan. Elizabeth continued her activism, addressing community meetings and calling local representatives, while Alexander tried to mitigate the damage, insisting on more humane and lawful methods. Behind the headlines, however, something else was brewing, an unexpected emotional entanglement. After the City Hall incident, Lucia discreetly reached out to Elizabeth, asking if Michael was okay, and if there were any medical bills. At first, Elizabeth suspected it was a ploy to smooth over Harrington's reputation, but Lucia's concern seemed genuine. She even mentioned that Alexander himself had asked about Michael's condition. Despite her lingering resentment, Elizabeth found her anger slowly colliding with a reluctant gratitude. She was thankful Alexander had intervened, though she still despised his overall role in threatening her home. The duality of these feelings was confusing, and she tried to keep them at bay. One afternoon, a local charity organization that Elizabeth had partnered with to find new homes for displaced residents invited her to a fundraising gala. It was to be hosted by none other than Harrington Enterprises, an unexpected philanthropic move on Alexander's part, likely orchestrated to improve public relations. Elizabeth didn't want to attend, but the charity insisted she speak about the plight of families like hers to potential donors. Elizabeth arrived at the gala feeling like a fish out of water. The venue was one of Manhattan's most elegant hotels, glittering chandeliers casting a warm glow on the wealthy patrons circulating in designer gowns and tuxedos. She wore a borrowed evening dress from a neighbor, her hair pinned up simply. Despite feeling self-conscious, she stood tall, determined to make a compelling case for the families in need. Alexander spotted her as soon as she entered. Her presence was like a single star appearing in a clouded sky, quiet yet impossible to ignore. She was clearly uncomfortable in this opulent setting, but her eyes shone with the same defiant resolve he remembered. Against his better judgment, he found himself drifting toward her. They locked eyes, the memory of that City Hall moment sparking between them. Alexander cleared his throat. "Miss Parker," he said formally, inclining his head. "I didn't realize you'd be attending." Elizabeth bristled, but she managed a polite nod. "The charity asked me to speak. I'm here for them." An awkward pause stretched. Neither knew what to say. The music swelled in the background, and couples glided across the dance floor. Finally, Alexander gestured to a quiet corner table. "Perhaps we should talk, away from all the noise." Curiosity and caution warred within her. In the end, she acquiesced, following him. They settled into chairs across from each other, each regarding the other warily. Alexander interlaced his fingers, choosing his words carefully. "I don't want to see children hurt," he murmured. "What happened to Michael was unacceptable. I made sure those men responsible have been fired. She nodded. I appreciate that. But the bigger issue remains. Where will we all go? He sighed, swirling the wine in his glass. We've begun discussing compensation packages for displaced families larger than the standard payouts. There's also talk of constructing a smaller affordable housing complex adjacent to the new development. Elizabeth's eyes widened. That's better than nothing, she managed, but it still doesn't solve everything. Silence enveloped them again, charged with a complexity neither could define. Elizabeth parted her lips to say something more, but a sudden commotion near the stage caught their attention. The event's hostess announced that it was time for the charity's keynote speaker, Elizabeth Parker. Heart pounding, Elizabeth excused herself. She stood at the podium, scanning the sea of affluent faces. Though her hands trembled, she found strength in the thought of Michael. With unwavering resolve, she spoke about families losing their homes, children uprooted from schools, elderly tenants facing homelessness. She described without naming him the cruelty of a system that valued profit above humanity. She felt Alexander's gaze from across the room. At first, she assumed it was purely critical, but as she continued, she noticed something else in his eyes. A quiet, smoldering turmoil, as though her words struck a chord he couldn't ignore. When she finished, the audience erupted into polite applause. Some moved, some merely performing courtesy. Alexander joined in expression unreadable. The seeds of something unanticipated had been planted that night. Tender sprouts of empathy, curiosity, and perhaps even attraction. But as with any delicate seedling, danger lurked nearby. Forces within Alexander's empire were already conspiring against this new shift, determined to extinguish any potential for compromise or compassion that might derail the lucrative deal. And so while a tentative connection formed between the single mother and the billionaire sabotage brewed in the shadows, threatening to uproot them both. Time seemed to accelerate after the gala. Alexander found reasons to cross paths with Elizabeth under the guise of offering expansions to the affordable housing units or discussing relocation packages. Each meeting left them both unsettled, yet strangely energized. Over coffee in a chic mid-town cafe, they'd trade barbs about corporate ethics and personal responsibility, only to find themselves lingering longer than necessary, drawn to an intangible tension that neither wanted to name. For Elizabeth, the swirling emotions were jarring. How could she possibly be drawn to a man whose empire threatened the roof over her head? She tried to remind herself of her anger and the harm his decisions inflicted on so many. But then she'd remember his steady arm catching her at City Hall, the concern in his voice, the unspoken vulnerability in his gaze when she detailed the struggles of single parents. Alexander, for his part, wrestled with old familial teachings. He'd built his career on ruthless efficiency, on shutting down compassion before it could bloom. But now, Elizabeth's courage and warmth chipped at the fortress he'd constructed. He tried rationalizing it as mere fascination and novelty. Yet day by day, a soft spot expanded in his chest, a place he had long denied. And then came the crisis that laid all these tangled emotions bare. Bruno Morales, the contractor Alexander had chastised, conspired with another high-level developer who harbored resentment toward Harrington. Together they arranged to sabotage the entire project in such a way that would scapegoat Elizabeth and her fellow activists. Their plan was to spark an accidental fire, blame it on protest vandalism, and force an immediate evacuation. Late one night, Elizabeth was awoken by the sound of alarm bells and frantic knocking. She bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering. Mrs. O'Leary was shouting from the hallway. Fire in the basement. "We have to get out." Panicked. Elizabeth scooped Michael into her arms, grabbing only her phone and purse. Thick smoke clung to the air as she rushed down the stairs. Neighbors coughing and shouting. The flicker of flames danced menacingly from below. Outside, firefighters battled the blaze, their hoses blasting water into windows now bursting with heat and sparks. Elizabeth clutched Michael to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she watched their building, her precious home engulfed in smoke and flame. Neighbors huddled close, some crying, some in shock. Sirens blared and the acrid smell of destruction filled the night sky. Meanwhile, news of the incident reached Alexander swiftly. Lucia, frantic, called him the moment she saw the breaking news. Harrington's face drained of color as he imagined Elizabeth and Michael trapped in that inferno. Without hesitation, he commandeered his private car and sped toward Queens, barking orders into his phone. He demanded confirmation that Elizabeth and the others were safe, that the building's residents were being evacuated. When he arrived, emergency vehicles lit the street in a kaleidoscope of red and blue. Alexander pushed past barriers and crowds, ignoring the protests of police. He found Elizabeth huddled with Michael under a foil blanket, soot smudged on their faces. Relief flooded him so intensely that he couldn't mask it. He rushed over, heart pounding. Elizabeth looked up, surprise and disbelief crossing her features. Before she could speak, Alexander crouched beside them, his voice shaking. "Are you all right? Is Michael hurt?" Elizabeth shook her head. "We're fine. Just terrified." She looked toward the blazing building, tears threatening to fall. We lost everything." Alexander swallowed hard. In that instant, something inside him shattered his last defenses, collapsing. He reached out his hand, hesitating before gently brushing a streak of soot from Elizabeth's cheek. To onlookers, it was a startlingly intimate gesture, filled with an emotion Alexander usually reserved for boardroom deals or carefully orchestrated philanthropic events. But this was raw, real. "I'll fix this," he whispered, though the resolution in his voice carried a lifetime of unspoken redemption. "I promise you, Elizabeth, I'll make sure you and Michael have a safe place to stay. This has gone too far. No more. I swear it." And in that moment, amid the chaos, the flashing lights, the roaring fire, they both knew the line between them had blurred. Whatever label they might give it, they cared deeply about each other. They stood on the precipice of a love neither had seen coming, yet it shone clearer than the flames consuming Elizabeth's old life. In the days following the fire, investigations revealed evidence of arson. The sabotage scheme emerged, implicating Bruno Morales and his associates who had hoped to expedite the demolition under the guise of a tragic accident. The moment Alexander confirmed the conspiracy, he took decisive action, terminating contracts, cooperating with law enforcement, and allocating emergency funds to rehouse the displaced families. Elizabeth and Michael found refuge in a furnished apartment arranged by Harrington Enterprises. Initially, Elizabeth was wary of accepting help from the very corporation that had threatened her home. But Alexander's sincerity was unmistakable. He oversaw every detail, ensuring the new apartment was child-friendly, stocking the fridge, even leaving a small stuffed dinosaur on Michael's bed. Each of these gestures chipped away at Elizabeth's guarded demeanor. She realized with increasing clarity that Alexander was not the same man who had callously dismissed her pleas weeks ago. Something profound had shifted. Perhaps it was the near tragedy that forced him to confront his buried compassion. Or perhaps it was simply his heart's response to the unwavering spirit he saw in Elizabeth. As the legal dust settled, Alexander stood before the media and publicly committed to a radically revised redevelopment plan. The new approach would limit displacement, incorporate affordable housing, and partner with local non-profits to support families. Reporters bombarded him with questions. Was this a change of heart, or just better? But Alexander answered calmly, pointing to personal responsibility and corporate accountability. The city buzzed with the news. Elizabeth watched the press conference live from her temporary apartment. A mixture of awe and gratitude surged within her as she listened to Alexander's words. He cited the importance of safe homes for families, highlighting the need to balance profit with social conscience. Though he never mentioned her name directly, Elizabeth sensed the unspoken acknowledgement. That evening, he visited Elizabeth and Michael with a final piece of good news. Harrington Enterprises would cover the cost of Michael's schooling for the next year to ensure he wouldn't fall behind academically due to the upheaval. When Elizabeth tried to protest, Alexander gently shook his head. "Please let me do this. It's the least I can do." She met his gaze, tears threatening to spill. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay you." Alexander's hand found hers, their fingers threading together in a moment of quiet understanding. "You don't have to," he murmured. All of this, it's changed me." Their eyes locked, an emotional current pulsing between them. Before either could speak further, Michael burst into the room, proudly showing a drawing he'd made, Alexander, Elizabeth, and Michael all holding hands before a bright yellow sun. Elizabeth laughed softly, taking the picture in her hands. Alexander smiled, something warm and unguarded lighting his features. In that ordinary, tender moment, the last of his defenses crumbled. There was no more denying how he felt about Elizabeth Parker and the little boy who'd snuck past all his walls. In the weeks that followed, Alexander transitioned from being just an ally to something more deeply intertwined in Elizabeth's life. He visited the apartment often, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes bringing new books for Michael. Their conversations no longer revolved solely around corporate ethics or housing policies. They found common ground in shared dreams, personal confessions and late-night phone calls, where the city lights twinkled outside their windows. The improbable love between a once cruel billionaire and a fearless single mother blossomed in the small but meaningful moments. Alexander reading bedtime stories to Michael Elizabeth, showing him the cheap Chinese takeout joint that was her comfort food, or quiet walks along the East River at dusk. It felt surreal, yet undeniably real. Despite the unorthodox start, they had discovered a bond forged through struggle, compassion, and mutual respect. Alexander Harrington was no longer the icy magnate so many had feared. And Elizabeth Parker was no longer just a desperate mother clinging to a threatened home. Together they were something new, a testament to the power of courage, empathy, and the unpredictable course of the human heart. And so, in a city known for its cutthroat pace and unattainable dreams, they wrote an unlikely love story. It was a story of redemption and hope, where a billionaire learned that true wealth lay not only in profit margins, but in kindness, and a single mother discovered that sometimes even the harshest souls can contain a boundless capacity for love. Thank you for joining us on this dramatic journey of love, hope, and redemption. If you were captivated by the twists and turns of Alexander Harrington's transformation from a heartless billionaire to a man touched by compassion, and if you felt Elizabeth Parker's fierce determination to protect what truly mattered, then this is just the beginning. There are countless stories waiting to unfold, each brimming with inspiration and drama. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next riveting tale. Together, let's keep finding the sparks of humanity that can light up even the darkest corners.